I'll move on to revenue. Okay. So back when the conversions were going crazy in the 80s, when there is a rent-controlled or stabilized tenant in the building, they got an insider price for their apartment. And the concept of flip tax was created to say if you flip that unit, then the building should get something back for that you got a lower price. So the term started as flip taxes, but really what exists now is what's called a transfer fee in most cases. Where there's a flip tax, sometimes it's the amount of profit you had, it's a complicated calculation. A transfer fee is very standard these days. They range, but roughly 2% of purchase price is what I see in my buildings. It's a way to give back to the building for the capital work that needs to be done in the future. So if you remember what I was saying about setting aside that $15,000 a year for the roof when it needed to be done in 20 years, a person has lived in the apartment for a period and has been living off of the roof, the elevator, this. A transfer fee is a way to recoup some of that money. Prospective purchasers used to look for buildings that didn't have them. They're less likely now. Most everybody accepts the transfer fees. So it's a great source of revenue. And your choices with that are to use it for operations or to designate it for reserves. Using it for operations has two problems. One is if you budget for it and it doesn't come in, now you have a deficit. For some reason there were no sales. In 2009 was a good year that there were a lot of buildings that didn't have many sales. And the other is you get used to the money by using it for operations and you need to keep feeding yourself. So some buildings will use it for operations but not budget for it. That's sort of the middle ground. And if it comes in, it's available. If your income and expenses are in line, it's available to go into that operational surplus account that I mentioned, the rainy day fund, in case there's a problem someday. We've got some extra funds. And then it can be used for capital if it wants to, if you wanted to. But a lot of the buildings are looking for a long-term funding vehicle. So we talked about the 10% Fannie Mae requirement. And this is a way for a co-op to put aside money. And that's a long-term funding vehicle, that 10%. Transfer fees going into the reserve fund that are designated is a long-term funding vehicle. There are some sophisticated purchasers who are looking and saying, what is the funding vehicle? Is there something that it's not going to be that I'm going to be assessed someday because of work that needs to be done on the building? We touched upon the storage units in my example before, but with the cost of going to a storage place plus the inconvenience of having to go there to get your stuff every time you want something, it's very helpful and everybody prefers the luxury of having the storage units in the building. It's my understanding that it makes sense to do it, and it's usually, you have two choices. You can either have an outside company come in and set it up and then they give you a piece of the action, or you can build it yourself. Most of the storage units in the buildings that I'm aware of are basically sold out. There are waiting lists. So it's a great way, if there's extra space, if it hasn't been done, it's a great way to raise money. Bike rooms are another source of revenue. We see how much the city is doing to try to make the city better for using your bike. So that's a great thing for the future. Gyms you can charge a fee to use the gym. Fitness centers are nice amenities that a lot of people are looking for. They don't want to have to go out to the fitness center, so that's a good one extra. The garages in the buildings tend to be rented to outside operators. It's really hard to run a garage if you're trying to do it yourself, so it generally makes sense to have the outside operator do it. They pay rent. And you can begin at this, get some really good competition if you have bidding, your leases are up. So it's a great source of money. I do have some buildings where the unit owners just use the spaces, but that's very rare. A lot of times people who live in the building will get a discount from the garage operator as part of the package. It's just a nice way to make it more comfortable for the people. And the garage operator gets a steady source. So it's good to work that out in the negotiations. So creating fees are a good way. I talked about what I call nickel and diming. And so some of those fees that are out there these days are move in and move out fees, sublet fees. So these are items which are charged to unit owners just when they do something, or tenants. What I normally suggest is that we ask a list from the property manager like Argo about the types of fees that are being charged in other buildings, and to see whether or not there are some that we should put in. Take a look at the amounts and see whether or not you're comparable to other buildings. Because we tend to see these sort of just get left and they don't get increased, and they could be a good source of revenue on and on. The laundry rooms, it's another pain to keep track of all those coins, so a lot of times there's an outside operator, but I have to tell you, the ones that do collect the coins seem to make a lot more money. So I don't know whether if you have a contract, when it comes up, whether you want to consider it. You do have the costs of repairing and maintaining it. If you're comfortable with your super, it's another source of good money. So it tends to be that there's a pretty good profit there. The cell phone bonanza maybe 20 years ago created a lot of need for antennas on the roofs of the buildings. It's a great source of revenue for a very small area of your roof being used up. It can give you some big money. Nowadays, it seems to be that most of the carriers have what they need, and they tend to come to you if they need your specific place to fill in their grid, but it's another option for additional funds. The cable into the building, it's an expensive proposition to wire it, but if when FiOS and Time Warner are really interested in it, they'll potentially give you an upfront payment to come into the building, or they'll share the revenue with you. So these are great sources of additional funds that come along. Under here, I just put a little cost savings. I know Mark said, we did cost the last time, but I just wanted to touch upon these. Cogeneration is a great way to end up creating some really good revenue. Cogeneration is where the building's hot water comes from the boiler that's run all year long, the heating boiler. If we can find another way to create the hot water, and we can have sub-meters in the building that we can charge the unit owners for their use of electricity, we can potentially consider running a generator which would create electricity. We sell it at a profit to the unit owners, and the extra heat that's created through that process heats the hot water. So if there's room to put it in, it's generally on buildings of 300 units or more. It's a great concept. And lastly, I always like to put in about it's cheaper to pay the men in the building to do work if they're capable for it than bring somebody in from the outside. So I've seen buildings find some big cost savings when they change supers and they put the strategy of giving super a payment as opposed to having other people come in, sending the super to a training course on the boiler, things like that. So just food for thought.
Stephen, you have worked extremely hard this morning. We're going to give you a little bit of a break.
That's great. I could use it.
Peter Weiner is here from Merrill Lynch, who is going to address the notion of what to do with your reserve funds.
Thank you.
Properly invested. We work with Peter with a lot of our buildings. Thank you, Stephen. And, always informative, and your command of the subject amazes me all the time. It's outstanding.
Good morning. Just by way of background, I was the board president of our building on 29 East 22nd Street until 2008 for 15 years. So I understand your pain, and I understand you guys have the worst unpaid job in New York City. And they should write sitcom episodes about it because the stories we can all collectively tell are legendary. I've been with Merrill Lynch for 34 years. We have a niche in the marketplace where we help manage co-op reserve funds. And I work closely with Stephen's firm and other accounting firms. And I've outlined, I have more material to hand out, but just in a brief outline here, I want to talk about a couple of things. How many of you come from the financial service world or accounting or, okay. Divorce yourselves of what you might be doing in your own investment portfolio. Divorce yourselves from the notion that you're managing a pension fund, an endowment, your own 401k, or making investment selections for your 401k plan. This is what we call corporate cash, and you have a fiduciary responsibility to manage it in a conservative manner. And therefore, we have narrowed it down to a very narrow focus. We buy treasury bills, CDs, and have money market instruments. We don't own any mutual funds, we don't own any stocks, we don't own any closed-end funds, we don't own any corporate bonds. We did own, prior to 2008, we had some government agency paper that was AAA rated, and it was, agency paper is not a direct obligation of the federal government, it's an indirect obligation of the federal government. So it's perceived to not be good if, God forbid, the federal government would have a problem, unlike treasuries. We don't own any typical investment securities in our portfolios. We do have buildings that will approach us from that from time to time. You might have a few that do it. It's few and far between that want to embark on a more sophisticated investment program with their reserve fund balances, primarily because you have to stand up before your boards at your annual meetings and say, oh, we lost money in 2008. And that's really the crux of the problem with managing reserve funds. So that's under suitability. Communication, we communicate, we send statements on a monthly basis, we send out a weekly rate sheet to keep people apprised of what rates are doing, and we are in constant communication either with the folks in the management company or people that are delegated or designated at the board level, whether it's a treasurer or a point of contact for managing the co-op reserve funds. So we give access to online statements. We don't provide any online access to your money, and I'll talk about that under control. But you can see your statements, you can talk to us on a regular basis and keep apprised of what your portfolio is doing on a timely manner. Under controls, and I'm sorry to rush because I know you guys are on the last speaker. Controls. Slow down a little bit. Make sure you have the right signatures on file. So we had an incident recently where a management company faxed over a document to us, digital fax. We looked at it, it had their letterhead, it's a known company in your space, and it was the week before the summer break. And I looked at it and thought, this is a little odd. It was, the payee is a building on the Upper East Side, the payee was Chase Manhattan Bank, and the woman was in Lexington, Kentucky. And I thought, this is really a strange thing. And I called the managing agent on the property, and I called the controller, and everyone was on vacation. Now, we didn't do the transfer. We just said, you know what, what's the rush here? It turned out that they were a victim of cyber fraud. Somebody had hacked into their system, scanned their letterhead. There were a couple of typos when we looked at it more carefully. Scanned signatures. The signatories were on file with us. We don't digitally capture the signatures, but the names were correct. But it was a complete example of cyber hacking, or whatever the technologists call it. So in our world, if I get a request to wire money out or do a payout, we pick up the phone and want that person to confirm on a recorded line. So controls are very, very important. Sometimes we make managing agents very unhappy because there's a change in board, We don't have new signatures on file, we don't have the new people on file, we're not gonna move the money. I've had it where people get really angry, and I'll stand by my conviction that we need to have, and you need to have those controls. Also under controls, we've had situations where a board treasurer or president who's had a fair amount of time on his or her hands has been shopping for rates and goes out into the marketplace and buys CDs from various institutions around the country and captured the signature cards themselves. So there was no centralized place to record when these CDs came due, when they matured, or what financial institutions they were represented by. And we're not a commercial bank, we're an investment firm. So if a CD matures in our world, it just goes back into the money market fund. We don't automatically roll it over like a bank does. So this was creating all sorts of problems. It took many, many months to let these CDs unwind, let them roll off, and consolidate these assets. Now, that's not to say that a financial institution like Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley or UBS is going to have the highest rates. We're generally not. We're not going to be the highest rate in the marketplace. You could go to a small savings and loan, you could go to Flushing Savings Bank, you could go to Sovereign, you could go to Signature. They oftentimes will have better rates than the major financial institutions have. However, you have to be aware of FDIC coverage limits, you have to be aware of who has control over the money, who has access to it, when things are going to come due, when things are going to roll off, and what your capital needs are. Under investment strategy laddering, this is a popular strategy we use for a lot of our co-ops, where we have maturities coming due on a regular basis to not take guesses on which way interest rates are going, not project out what Bernanke or now it's Yellen is going to do. We might have buildings that will have 2-3-year ladders. We might have buildings that will have what we call bullet maturity. So for example, I'm working with a building on the Upper East Side that's doing a significant window project. Now I knew about the window project a number of years ago, and the capital project is probably about $1 million. So we targeted $1 million of their reserve funds to come due around the time that this project is going to start to roll off. So there's complete flexibility. And outlook, I wrote that down, that's a big question mark. I don't know which way interest rates are going. I don't know if anyone really could predict what Yellen is going to do, how fast short-term rates are going to rise, if they're going to rise at all. So that's why the laddering strategy, having maturities come due on a regular basis, makes sense, because as things mature, you're rolling out to the next longest maturity if rates start to go up. If rates go down, at least you've locked in some shorter term, some reasonably good rates. Two things. We, in conjunction, I have copies of all of this stuff in my folders. We had one building we worked with who developed an investment policy statement. And some buildings have incorporated it into their bylaws. I'm not so certain that's a real good use of legal capital and expense. But what I think is important is that you incorporate people who are not financially savvy on the board, and especially in the financial functions. Most times you don't get people who want to be treasurer or controller because they're not financially savvy. And one of the things that they have difficulty with is managing the reserve funds. What do I do with this large amount of capital? So what this building did with our help was develop an investment policy statement, which is a guidepost for laddering CDs, what the suitable investments are, how much money they want to keep liquid, and they use it. And that way, if somebody comes off the board and a non-financial person comes on the board, that person is able to look at this and say, okay, this really does make a lot of sense in terms of continuity, in terms of not having investment expertise, and not having to deviate from the legacy of previous boards and previous board members and what the managing agents and the accounting firms have always encouraged. And finally, our fees, we charge $300 a year to have an account with Merrill Lynch, and then we have a $35 wire transfer fee for wire transfers. If we physically cut checks on your behalf, there are no fees involved. We often get written requests, via fax, to cut checks to third parties, elevators, you name the subcontractors. We're more than glad to do that if our controls are in place and the proper signatures and the confirmations are there. I'm sorry to rush through this. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions.
Peter or Stephen, perhaps you can comment on the when it's an appropriate time to borrow from those reserve funds for a purpose, and like say real estate taxes, you run short on your escrow, and you need to generate revenue or generate some income that they, a real estate tax bill or an insurance premium.
We have not had a lot of incidences where people have borrowed from reserve funds. I know one building on, it was 190 72nd Street, it's on 72nd and 3rd Avenue. It's where the old movie theater was, for any of the people in Manhattan. There's a runner's shop there now. It's a land lease, it's the Goldman family owns the underlying property. And they were dealing with renovating their commercial space, and they were looking for working capital. So they borrowed against their investment portfolio to create working capital to fund the renovation so that they could generate more income for the building. But that's the only time in my career that I've really ever had any requirement. One thing that investment firms will do differently than banks will do, we'll maintain a market in these certificates of deposit and all the securities that we have in the portfolio. So if somebody wants to get out of something early, let's say there is a real estate tax or the water heater has to be replaced, or there's something of a big capital project that was unexpected, you can sell your CDs or your treasuries early at the market price, and that way you'll generate the proceeds. We don't impose a penalty, like a bank will ding you for an interest charge. We'll give you the market price plus the accrued interest up until the point of sale. So occasionally we'll have something, as an example, somebody made a mistake, or some capital project arose that wasn't expected, and they have to liquidate a part of their reserve funds prior to the maturity date. But that would be the only time I've experienced that.
What'll happen is, I mentioned the operating surplus, operating reserve account. If that doesn't exist, then if funds are needed swiftly, borrowing from the reserve fund is an option as long as we keep track of it and put the money back. So there should be a plan how we're going to pay it back. It's best to try to get it closed out before the year-end financial statement so that it's not disclosed on the financial statement that the borrowing existed at the end of the year. But it's perfectly fine to do it if we're doing the accounting as well as Argo does with the different funds. We can keep track of it, we can move it, and then we can move it back somehow. But there really needs to be a plan. If we needed $75,000, where's it going to come from? Are we going to take it from operations at $5,000 a month? We're going to do an assessment. How are we going to get it back? So that's just the political side of it. It needs to just be resolved, but it's available. It's an available option.
What's the tax consequences of borrowing from a capital improvement reserve fund to use operating expenses?
As long as you keep track of it that you borrowed it, you have a plan in place and you ultimately put it back, nothing. But you may remember I talked about if we tell the unit owners in advance it's for capital, we put it in, we had to use it for capital for them to get that additional step up in basis, okay? So that would disappear if we use the money for operating expenses and not put it back. But as a temporary loan, it's perfectly fine to do it.
But the co-op is not crystallizing a taxable event of some kind.
It does not happen until it doesn't go back. And I would say you would need, that's why I like to have the plan in place where it says in the board minutes, we're gonna pay it back $5,000 a month. That way I can clearly defend it if there's an issue. But if it's vague and it never gets paid back, it's gonna create an issue. But it won't be taxable to the co-op, it'll be taxable on the individual level potentially. So those are the important sides of it.
I apologize, you were asking about, I was answering it from a mechanical investment standpoint. Thank God Stephen's here to answer from an accounting standpoint. I was really focusing on how to use the actual portfolio and either monetize it or convert it to cash versus the capital versus operating expense
Can
differential.
you use the portfolio to leverage?
As I said, that one building did it, and it was somewhat costly because they had to render a legal opinion that they were allowed to use their reserve funds as collateral for a loan. So it wasn't just sign on the dotted line and get it done. It was pretty involved.
There's a political cost.
Yeah.
When people hear about it, that's the problem.
Peter, can you talk about the insurance at
Okay,
Maryland?
great question. So prior to 2008, no one ever worried about a money market fund and breaking the dollar or breaking the buck, which was always we used to have our institutional money market funds are managed by BlackRock, And you know, during the financial crisis, there were lots of concerns about Merrill Lynch going bankrupt and other financial institutions. We saw Lehman, we saw Bear Stearns, we saw all the difficulties that all of the major Wall Street firms experienced. After 2008, we shifted the lion's share of our money market funds to bank deposits, so they're FDIC insured. Now, the limits are $250,000 per depository institution. We have programs where we can shift money electronically to, I think we have 60 banks within a money market fund universe. So it's liquid, it's not tied up in a CD. It's 100% FDIC insured. So if we have a building that has, you know, over $250,000 and wants to maintain 100% liquidity and wants that completely insured, we can electronically, it's on one statement, you're not doing anything mechanically. We can set up, it's called our insured savings account. We can shift that money electronically to a variety of other banks so that each line item is a maximum $250,000. Now, when we buy certificates of deposit, our systems block us from buying more than the FDIC coverage. So on the CD side, and I speak for my competitors at UBS and Morgan Stanley, we represent probably at any given point 50 different banks around the country with different maturities anywhere from 3 months on out to 10 years. So we have, I'd say the biggest reserve fund we have is just under 8 million, and 99% of it is all in CDs. So if you do the math, 250 divided by 8 million, you've got a lot of banks. But the difference is it's on one statement, it's one report, it's one tax report for these guys so they don't hate us, and it's 100% FDIC insured. Occasionally, Stephen's firm will pick up on and you'll do it on your annual report, where there's money in the reserve funds that are uninsured. Okay, and I don't know the phraseology. And I'll get a phone call from Richard or somebody else in the organization or a co-op board member, and for whatever reason, there might be a sum of money that is not perfectly tied to the right money market fund, that these guys carefully look at all your balances and flagged and noted that it wasn't in an insured format. And then we'll just shift it electronically. So we never seem to run out of insurance coverage. And then you can always shift things into treasuries if you really are concerned about the bank liability. And the treasuries are fully backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government.
In speaking about what is an appropriate way of investment, I think you had mentioned that to us privately, there are times when you go into the equities market and invest some of the reserve funds.
You mentioned you have a building.
I have a building that does it.
Yeah.
It's very uncommon. The building has done all their major repairs and replacements. They had an inventory of units that they took back from the sponsors, sold them at a profit, so they had all the money. They couldn't return it to the unit owners, so the decision was that it will let it grow and be there, and all the unit owners were informed that how they were investing it. Just so that's the political side, is you don't want to go into something like that without telling people in advance that you're doing it. That way, if there is a 2008, as I heard Peter say, you don't stand there and say, it was our decision to do it. So it's rare, but it does happen. But when you think about a new construction condo here in Manhattan who won't be replacing their elevators for 50 years, is it such a bad idea for a small piece of that 10% to be put in for something like that, so that because the costs of replacing an elevator are going to go up inflationally. You're never going to keep up with it with regular interest rates. But if you were in stocks, theoretically, you would keep up with inflation. So there is a side to say it. It just doesn't happen.
It just doesn't.
It doesn't happen very much.
It doesn't. There's not an appetite for it. I had one building on Fifth Avenue, and it was a small building with one floor units, you know, 10, 15, $20 million units. And they talked about it, but we realized that they needed to have the buy-in politically of everyone in the building, that if things went poorly, that there wouldn't be any acrimonious towards the board or the managing agent or the accounting firm or the lawyers or ultimately us. We always get sued. So, you know, we try to avoid those kinds of situations.
What percentage of the reserve funds that you handle are in liquid assets and how those are shared?
That's a great question. It really depends upon, every building is different. I have a building on 74th Street that's been in cash for 20 plus years. They don't want to put any of their capital into CDs or anything, and they're perfectly content at whatever the prevailing short-term zero interest rates are. I have other buildings that are very active, and they keep a very close eye on minimum value. For example, I have a building up on Park that has a very healthy flip tax, and when they flip an apartment, I get a check for $250,000, $300,000, $400,000. They have no commercial tenants. They have no capital projects going on right now. So that reserve fund is about $7.5 million, and they only keep $500,000 liquid. And the rest is laddered in CDs that come due 1 through 3 years. And then, of course, they have their operating funds. But it's really, I don't think, and I would defer to you on this, is there a standard that, I see buildings all over. I have buildings on Park Avenue that have no money, that absolutely have zero cash in their reserve funds. So I talk to the managing agent, and they're like, oh, they have no money. And they know that at some point, if they have to replace an elevator or do a roof or a local 11 work or whatever project comes up, it's going to be an assessment. So they run basically flat. Their revenue and expenses net out. They have maintenance increases to cover their operating expense increases, and they fund all of their capital projects either through flip taxes, which may not happen, or through assessments.
So a minimum reserve fund, we try to use a per unit amount, that way we can use different size buildings. So a minimum is generally $2,000 a unit. And I said before that you can't spend that money to have it. This is a unique situation where everybody's comfortable writing a check for whatever, whenever they need to do it. So that's the amount. But really what should be in the reserve fund is a reflection of that study of where in the useful life all the components of the building are, how many years they have left, what it's going to cost to replace them. And the lawyers say not to put that in the financial statement, but if it exists, we have to change our disclosure to say, we know what it is, but we are not telling you, as opposed to the usual disclosure is, we haven't looked. So that's where the quandary comes in. You can generally, with a strong superintendent and a property management firm like Argo, you can come relatively close to what you're going to need over a period of, let's say, 10 years. And you can work with that number, but that's the basic one. I have buildings that have, as I said, as high as $100,000 a unit, and I have them where I have to struggle to keep them at $2,000, where I'm constantly saying, I suggest you do it, I suggest you do it. And like Peter said, I don't want to be the guy that somebody turns to and says, you didn't tell us. That I don't want them looking at me, so I'm the one who's putting in a comment letter every year saying, your reserve fund should be higher. Boards change, things go on politically, things change. So it can be that way once where we're ready for assessment, a new board comes in and we can have a totally different ball game. And the new board saying, how could we have run without a reserve fund? So, but generally the $2,000 a unit, $100,000 minimum is a minimum reserve fund everybody's looking for nowadays.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was late.
I actually spoke for 25 minutes.
I did?
I'm sorry. That's amazing.
Went over.
That was pretty good. So we appreciate everybody coming. Hang out if you want. We're going to be here for a little while, for about another 20 minutes or so, and ask some questions privately. And we look forward to seeing everybody at the 5th Annual Treasurer's Breakfast next year.